John and myself, we had the pleasure of presenting at the first in-person CyberCon in a couple of years. Very kind of cool. It was great to see so many people that we had known before, some of which are present here, met a bunch of new people there, really super excited about all of that there. But we were talking about the theme for the CyberCon was extreme losses. And friends of the show here may know that we've done a few things on extreme losses over the past few years there. So we were super excited to participate in giving some tips on how to both manage and measure and then report on extreme losses, what we call whimsically the devil's tail. Again, not going to go over the full presentation there. This is just to give you some flavor of some of the key findings that we had there. The recording for this will be available to CIRA members and is available to CIRA members right now if you go out to the C-Event website there. But never fear, if you don't happen to be a member of that as well, the slide deck will be made available as well. So you can still get some of the content there even without our scintillating presentation. So one of the things we're trying to communicate in this is that we've been dealing with extreme for several years now. And we've been trying to struggle with how do we even define this concept of extreme. And we've had a couple of different definitions, even in our own research. In IRIS 2020, we talked about the 95th percentile from a loss magnitude perspective. Then we went into the extreme IRIS report there, where we were looking at the 100 worst events. We were looking at by loss magnitude and record count. We then went into ripples and tsunami, where we were looking at multi-party breaches. And then we kind of played it old school with the most recent IRIS 2022, where we're working with CISA, where we went back to 90th percentile with one important distinction. We introduced this new measure of TVAR, or the tail value at risk. And so the question is, why is this important? Why are extreme events important? And one of the things we posited was this concept of 3 different modes of managing risk. Now, all models are flawed, to quote Box on this there, but this is useful. At the most common end, you have the things that you just kind of do as a course of doing business, the virus in the laptop, et cetera, there. In the middle, you have things that are covered here by these types of things, where you see the typical event in one of our IRIS reports, where you see the typical event is about $250,000, $260,000. And those are the things you're spinning up your CSIRT for, and you want to try to mitigate. And then these things that are out in the extreme, the 95th percentile, are the things that you really want to transfer risk, because they're really potentially business impacting viability perspective. So insurance comes into play here. And so a TVAR is a great calculation where you've got $52 million at the 95th percentile, but you notice that tail goes way out there to the 10 billion, even more. So how do you measure that? Well, one calculation for doing that is with the tail value at risk calculation, which is essentially looking at everything over the 95th percentile and then averaging just that portion of that, actually taking the mean of it there. So we actually are talking about a true average, as is commonly referred to. I'll kind of breeze through this there, not to take up too much more time here, but essentially what we're trying to answer is this question of, given a certain loss magnitude, how much is it likely to be? And I would encourage you to come and check out the reports there, because we've got some interesting graphs showing how stable is this value over time. And the answer is that it is stable, but the tail is changing shape in what we've seen in our observed data set there. And that has some very interesting ramifications on TVAR and the observed mean. And there's even more in the presentation, which I'm leaving out here. John had a fantastic section talking about biases there. John, is there anything you wanted to call out in particular here?
The big takeaway is simply that, as important as it is to get the numbers right, and we seem to think, TVAR is a good way of approaching that, how it gets communicated can be just as important. How you talk about small numbers, how you talk about big numbers, can actually affect how your audience perceives their own ability to influence outcomes. So using a little bit of behavioral economics and how we reframe things, which you can see some examples on the slide, but these are techniques we implement in our own research. If you ever happen to zoom in on our axes and their teeny tiny percentages, you'll see we use this 1N framing, and you'll see we often use the kind of, this value is 10 times this other value, just to kind of anchor our audience's perception a little better. So just kind of eating our own dog food here and trying to share a little bit of the magic behind the scenes on how you can approach, your next board presentation.
I think one of the highlights for me on this was one of the biases that you listed was the G.I. Joe fallacy, where knowing is really only less than half the battle.
I thought you were going to say that the memes were the highlight, but I appreciate that actually some of the content was
of course they are. Our high quality cat gifts were the highlight as always. But in all seriousness, I really love that that fallacy and that bias there, and that the data is amazing, but you have to be able to communicate that information in order to actually make an action upon it there. And that is a really key thing that we try to keep in mind always.